What a beautiful way to kick us off. Welcome, everybody. Namaste, Sitaram. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome from wherever you're joining us today. I want to begin by thanking you all for investing your time and joining in this very important conversation. For those of you who are in classes with me, it's going to be quite of a bit of a different type of vibe today as we dive into a powerful chapter of history, one that has shaped many, many generations up till today, and one that will continue to influence our world as we continue to move forward. So it was very, very fun going through all of the registration forms and seeing just the wide demographic of people who are here today, and understanding why you want to learn more about this topic. Many of you have said in your forms that you know a little bit about Indian indentureship despite being direct descendants. Some of you have said you know somebody who's a descendant. I have Dr. Nanalji who said, I'm from the land from where the descendants came. And so we have different levels of experience and so on. My hope today is to fill or to help to fill some of those gaps in our knowledge of what happened around Indian indentureship. Even for those of us who may have studied the topic in school, for those of us growing up in the Caribbean, we had to learn a little bit about indentureship. But the history books are only as good as those who write them, right? And so today we'll test and maybe even challenge some of what we've been told about all that happened and why. So like I said, we have a diverse group of folks with us today. We have from the very young, like single digits, all the way up to those in their 70s. And you all come from all over the world. We have folks on here from the United States, from Canada, Trinidad, Guyana, even India, with varying levels of exposure to the topic. And so we will try our best to keep it at a level where there is adequate understanding from everybody. But we're all here for the same reason, which is to learn more about Indian indentureship. So welcome, 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 and thank you for being here. Thank you for your commitment to keeping these extremely important stories alive. So of course, before we begin, I must offer my salutations to my parents and my first Siksha Guru, without whom none of this would be possible. As we join in an opening prayer, I ask you to honor the memory of your parents, whether they are here, whether they have passed on, and your ancestors as well, your teachers as well. In your own way, bring them to your mind and offer them a moment of gratitude as we join in this opening prayer. Om Brahmanandam Paramasukhadam Kevalam Jnanamurtim Dvandvatitam Gaganasadrusham Tattvamasyadilaksham Ekam Nityam Vimalamachalam Sarvadhi Sakshibhutam Bhavatitam Trigunarahitam Sadrusham Tam Namami. Om Namo Paramatmane Namaha. So why are we here today? What are we going to be chatting about? So this session is entitled 1845 and Beyond, the Indentureship Story. But in order to get to 1845, we have to go back a few hundred years in history. And so don't let that intimidate you. I'm hoping that it's not going to bore you to death. We have to take a bit of a history lesson to understand where we are today. So we're going to look at what was happening in the world before indentureship began. What were the things that led to indentureship? Why did it start? And what was the reality of life for an indentured worker? What were they promised? What was the reality? How did they deal with it? And then how did they move forward? And we'll wrap up the conversation today with a conversation on why does any of this matter today? Why do we need to know any of this? Why can't we leave the past in the past and just move forward? Sometimes we hear people saying that, but why does any of this matter today? So this is, a brief overview on what we're going to discuss today. We begin with some geography. So we start in the 1400s. And in the 1400s, all of the major European powers of the world were in a race. A race for what? They were racing to find a route that was cheap, that was quick from Europe to India. From Europe to India. And I say an alternative route, and we'll talk about why shortly. Now, trade and travel between Europe and India, that wasn't a new thing. For centuries, many centuries, they had been using what was known as the Silk Road. So the Silk Road, if you look here, it's zoomed into the map, you'll see Europe on this side, India on this side, and China next to India, right? So the Silk Road was essentially a network of roads and routes that connected Europe with China. And what this did was it enabled trade across the regions, right? So from Europe all the way through China, of course, touching India, it enabled trade throughout this entire region. And the Europeans, they relied very heavily on this network as goods, including silk, and that is why the road was given the name the Silk Road. These goods were in very high demand from India. So what types of goods were they looking at? The Europeans, they lauded the spices of India, so like black pepper, cardamom, cinnamon, cloves, spices that we still use today. Textiles, right? So we spoke about silk, but also fine cotton, wool fabrics, precious stones, diamonds, rubies, sapphires, dyes for coloring fabrics like indigo, ivory for carvings, jewelry, and decorative items, and teas. These were the different types of goods that were being imported by Europe from India. But by the 15th century, it was becoming increasingly expensive for merchants to transport the goods from India back to Europe. And why was that? If you look at the map, you'll see in the middle, so the red line that you're looking at, that is the Silk Road, the route through the land. When you look at the blue lines, those are the maritime or the ocean routes, right? Now, a lot of European trade happened via land. And if you look at the route of the road, it passed through Persia. And the Persians, on realizing that, hey, these goods from India and China are in very high demand, but they have to pass through our country in order to get them, we are going to charge them some hefty fines. We're going to increase their taxes and make sure that we are getting our share of the monies. So the Persians, they increased their taxes. And so the Europeans, they pretty soon realized that, wait a minute, this is becoming too expensive for us. They weren't willing to stop importing the goods from India because they loved it so much. So they decided that they needed to find an alternative route. Everybody with me so far? All right, awesome. Now, Portugal, see to the side of Spain here, Portugal decides to take the lead. And so they decide that instead of crossing over Persia into India, they were going to sail down south around the coast of Africa and then head back up east into India. So Portugal took the lead and now they are winning the race. But at the same time, other European powers, they are continuing to look for a faster and a cheaper route in order to compete with Portugal. This is where Christopher Columbus enters. The year is now 1492, and our boy Chris has a plan. He says, instead of going the long way around Africa, we're not doing that. Instead of crossing Persia and paying hefty fines, we're not doing that. What we will do is sail west. We're going to sail west, and if we sail far enough, eventually we will reach the east. Now, Christopher Columbus was not wrong because it had long been established that the earth was round. So if you went west far enough, you'll end up in India. So with this plan, Christopher decided to go and, pitched this idea to the various monarchies within Europe. He first went to Portugal, and Portugal said, but we already have quite a lucrative route that we are happy with. So thanks, but no thanks. So Chris, he was not about to be, demotivated. He next went to Great Britain, he went to France, and he went to several other European countries. But every time he was rejected. Nobody was interested in what they considered to be a risky idea that was being presented to them by Christopher Columbus. Finally, he goes to Spain. And at that time, the king of Spain was Ferdinand. The queen was Isabella. For those of us who grew up in the Caribbean, hopefully some of this history is starting to come back to our memories. So he goes to Ferdinand and Isabella. And he tells them, he says, listen, I have this idea, and I'm very sure it is going to work. He says, I will sail west, and I will eventually reach India. He says, not only am I going to find you a new way to get to India that nobody else has found so far, he says, but I will find you new places to trade with. And any lands that I find on my way to India, I will colonize them in the name of Spain. Any treasures that I find, I will bring it back for you. And any people that I find, I will convert them into Catholicism. So this is the idea that Christopher Columbus, he pitched before Ferdinand and Isabella. So Spain, on hearing this, they agree. And they decide that they would give Christopher Columbus 3 ships. Anybody remembers what are the names of these 3 ships? Feel free to unmute and shout it out.
Pinta, Nina, and Santa Maria.
Right, Nina, Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Very good. I think it's on the Trinidad and Tobago coat of arms up to today, right? And so these 3 ships are given to Christopher Columbus by the Spanish government. And with a bit of a questionable crew, we're not going to get into the details of that. Christopher Columbus, he set sail from the coast of Spain on August 3rd, 1492, with the hopes of finding India. Fast forward, just over 2 months later, on October 12th, 1492, Columbus reaches land. And he is very, very happy because he thinks he has reached India. Now, Christopher Columbus was right that if you sailed west far enough, you will get to India. But what he severely miscalculated was the distance from Spain to India and the size of the world. So when he landed ashore, he felt certain that he had reached India. But was it India that he had reached? Unmute. Where did he reach?
Hispaniola.
Let's say the Caribbean. He had reached the Caribbean, but not just the Caribbean. To be more specific, it was the Bahamas Islands. Now, let's look at a reenactment of this conversation, or at least my depiction of what happened when Christopher met the natives who were living there. So he pulls up on the shore of the Bahamas, and he says, hello, I am Christopher. This must be India. So the natives living there, they said, hi, Chris, actually, this is Guanahani, and you're in the Bahamas. So Columbus, he said, in his arrogance, I will call it San Salvador. So the people in Guanahani, they said, why would you call it San Salvador? That doesn't sound anything like Guanahani. Why would you even do that? But Christopher, he's in his own world, right? And so he says, and of course, you must be Indians. Why? Because I have arrived in India. Still living in his own world inside his head. So they said, no, we are not Indians. We are the Taínos tribe. We are the Taínos tribe. Columbus said, you could call yourselves what you want, but I will call you Indians. The Taínos now, they are taken aback and they said, what? Why? What's wrong with this guy? What's going on with him? Right? So while this might appear to be a silly depiction of what happened, it actually is pretty accurate, right? Because Columbus, he landed on the island, he colonized it in the name of Spain, he changed the name to San Salvador, and he proceeded to do that with every other island that he landed on. And he even changed the external identity of the native people. They identified as Tainos. He said, no, I will call you Indians. And he refused to believe that he had not reached India, even after he realized he was wrong sometime afterwards. He still called these islands the West Indies or West India. So at first, Christopher's interactions with the natives was very civil, right? But soon he noticed that many of them were either wearing or carrying items that were made of gold and silver. And this is where Hispaniola Chitra comes in. Or overcome with greed and knowing that he needed to prove his worth to the king and queen who had invested in him in this voyage, um, he decided that he must find this gold and silver. And so what he proceeded promptly to do was to enslave the natives of Guanahani and all the surrounding islands. And he began forcing them to mine for this gold and silver. Now that he had, this booty of treasure, he began making trips back to Spain and taking back his loot. And every time he would return with loot, he would come back and he would bring more Spaniards with him. And King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, they encouraged Spaniards to settle on the Caribbean islands. So by now it wasn't just the Bahamas, but it was all or many of the Caribbean islands. And the King and the Queen of Spain, they promised these colonizers that in exchange for converting the natives to Christianity, you would be awarded land on these islands. So soon, many of the Caribbean islands became permanent colonies for Spain, and this marked the start of European expansion and colonization. So you're probably wondering, what does this have to do with indentureship? I promise we are leading there very soon. So the Spanish, they set up colonies in the Caribbean. And after a while, it appeared that the gold and the silver had run out. They were no longer finding anything that was worth anything to them. So what were they going to do next? They started looking around. And what they found was the climate was beautiful. There was a lot of sunshine. The soil appeared to be fertile in many places. And so they decided that what they would do would be to grow sugarcane. By the 1600s, sugar was considered to be real gold. If you controlled sugar, you controlled wealth. And in Europe, everybody wanted to control wealth. So this lucrative business of the Spaniards growing sugarcane in the Caribbean started. But soon, when you're prospering and other people start observing, and other European nations started seeing the profits that the Spanish were raking in, and they wanted a piece of the action. So what happened? The French, the Dutch, and the Danish, they jumped in, and they started colonizing, and they started setting up plantations and turning islands into sugar factories. But the competition was fierce, and it was only a matter of time before the biggest power player of all would take notice. Anybody want to guess who the biggest power player is?
Great
The
Britain.
British.
England.
England, the Great Britain, the British made their move. The British, they saw sugar as the key to wealth and dominance. And so by the 17th century, they had taken control over prime colonies. So of course they fought the Spanish and they took their land. Prime colonies such as Guyana and Trinidad. And they transformed them into massive sugar plantations. In the group here with us today, we have a lot of descendants of sugarcane farmers. I myself, my father was a sugarcane farmer. And anybody who's worked in the cane fields would tell you that producing, so from planting to growing to harvesting sugar, is not an easy thing. It's very, very difficult. It requires a lot of labor. It requires, strong strength. And so it required an enormous labor force to upkeep the plantations that were being set up by the British in the Caribbean. But the British had two problems. The first one is they didn't want to do the work themselves. None of the Europeans wanted to come and work the sugar plantations. And the second was that the indigenous populations that they had enslaved, was starting to die. Why? Because of diseases that they themselves had brought to the island, and because of violence. Because when the tribes, the indigenous people fought back, they were promptly killed by the Europeans. So with this problem in hand, the Europeans had to figure out, or the British at this point had to figure out what they were going to do next. So after wiping out most of the indigenous population, where did they turn? We all know they turned to Africa. Millions of Africans were kidnapped and shipped across the ocean and forced into slave labor in the Caribbean. These African slaves worked in brutal conditions, and many of us are familiar with what those were. They faced violence, they faced overexhaustion, and they had no freedom. And all of this was for what? So that the Europeans could get richer. But it was paying off, at least for the Europeans, because by the 1700s, the Caribbean was producing almost 90% of the sugar that Europe consumed. Colonies like Jamaica, Trinidad, and Barbados became major British colonies, built completely on slavery. And for centuries, slavery remained a huge part of the British colony. African slaves, we know, were forced to work on not only sugar plantations, but also cotton and tobacco plantations, all again to make massive profits for these British merchants. But by the early 19th century, so we're jumping forward, right? By the early 19th century, again, the global climate was changing. Slavery was getting a lot of bad PR throughout the entire world and even back home in Britain. There were activists like William Wilberforce, who was rallying a lot of British support, and he had collected more than 1.3 million signatures who were petitioning the end of slavery. On top of that, there had been increased slave rebellions on the plantations. These were becoming more and more frequent. And despite the slaves being beaten and punished and sometimes even killed, the plantation owners found that the Africans, they were not going to stop resisting. More and more frequently, they were revolting. But most importantly, on top of that, slavery had become less profitable to the plantation owners. It had stopped making economic sense to them. So let's look at what we mean by that. The plantation owners, they were learning that slavery was expensive and that paid labor could bring huge savings and make them more profitable. But how? Slavery is free. Paid labor is paid. How does that work? So let's look at the cost. So paid labor had cheaper upfront costs. So with slaves, they had to be purchased upfront. They had to be purchased outright. And on the other hand, paid workers, you could hire them and hire them only for a set period of time. And this would save plantation owners from making large upfront investments. In addition to that, plantation owners had no lifelong obligation to paid workers, right? So slaves were considered property, meaning that the owners had to house them, had to feed them, had to care for them indefinitely. And even though they didn't do it in a great way, it was still their responsibility. But with paid laborers, the owners were only responsible for them while the contracts lasted. And once the contract was up, the workers could leave or they could sign a new one if the plantation owners needed them. Now, this is in theory, right? We'll get to the reality soon. And then finally, plantation owners had more flexibility. So that meant that depending on the demand, plantations could adjust the number of workers that they were hiring. If business was slowing down, they could simply let contracts expire and not renew them instead of being stuck with permanent labor like they had been with slaves and had to carry them even during slow times. So this would be cheaper and more convenient for plantation owners. So with all of these factors coming to the surface, the plantation owners and the British government, they agreed. And in 1833, the Slavery Abolition Act was passed, with full freedom of slaves being granted in 1838. Now, in the wake of emancipation, the same problem arises. There's a problem of labor. And this problem of labor, it's growing stronger. So what did the Europeans do? they turned to different types of indentured labor and they began testing it within the Caribbean. Does anybody know what were some of the different types of indentured labor that were tried in the Caribbean and in other British colonies, not just the Caribbean?
You mean nationalities?
Yes.
Portuguese,
Portuguese,
Chinese,
Chinese.
Indians.
Yeah, Indians came later.
Uh,
Even African. Even African. You know what? That didn't last too long. The Africans were like, right, you're telling me to get on the boat and you're going to pay me this time? Not happening. We're not doing that. So that ended real quick. And then the Europeans and the Chinese, those indentureships did not last as well pretty soon because they were just treating these laborers just as they had done with the slaves, right? So I want to pause here and make sure that everybody's tracking or understanding what's happening in the Caribbean up until this point, from the time Columbus arrives to this point of slavery kind of ending. We did that in a quick 15 minutes. I want to pause there and make sure everybody's good. So give me a thumbs up if you're good. All right, awesome. So then let's keep going. So now that we know what's happening in Europe and in the Caribbean, let's head over east to India, where we started this, right? So we're heading back to India to see what's happening there during this time. So while all of this was going on in the Caribbean, on the other side of the world, the British had arrived in India in the early 1600s. So I want us to pause and imagine what India was like in the 17th century. What do you think the British found when they went? What do you think they did when they went? And most importantly, what do you think they left behind? So as we're going through all of this, you're probably, again, asking yourself, you know, Tara, get to the point. What does any of this have to do with indentureship? But when we talk about indentureship, especially for those of us in the Caribbean, we often hear the same story. We hear that slavery ended, that a new labor source was needed. We hear that India was poor. There was a lot of poverty in India. And so leaving India seemed like the better option for the Indians. And that's usually kind of where the story ends. That's where the narrative stops for us. But the real question is, why was the India labor force so ready to be pulled into the indentured work? Why was the India's labor force so ready to be pulled into indentured work? On the registration form, one of the questions I asked was, what are you hoping to get out of this session? And Anjani G gave like my favoriteest answer. She said, I want to understand why my ancestors chose indentureship. I want to understand why my ancestors chose indentureship. Why did they choose to leave India? And as we move forward, that is part of the question that we're going to try to answer. Why was India's labor force so ready to be pulled into indentured work? We're going to look at a video, and then we'll dive deeper into the conversation. The video that we're going to look at, it gives a really good summary of what was happening in India leading up until this point, but it moves quickly. So I encourage you to pay close attention because it's important for the narrative as we move forward.
In the year
Can you all hear?
1700, India's share in the world's economy was an astounding 27%, more than all of Europe combined. 250 years later, India's share had dropped to less than 3%, and its people were left impoverished. What happened? Strap in, adventurers. We're about to dive into a dark and messy history. Welcome to 18th century India. In 1707 CE, the death of Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb sends the empire into a decades-long spiral. In his wake, an endless parade of weak princelings forced themselves upon the peacock throne. With the Mughal Empire teetering on the brink of collapse, regional powers jostled for supremacy. Land grabs and title claims, infighting and betrayal. India is vulnerable. The situation is so precarious that in 1739, Persian Emperor Nadir Shah invades North India and sacks Delhi. During this period of disorder, the British sensed opportunity. Leveraging their unique advantages as a foreign power, they bribed and blasted their way into a dominant position in the subcontinent. India was no stranger to dealing with foreign aggression, but the British were not like those who had come before. No. They were not like Nadir Shah, who looted and simply left. Nor were they like the Huns, who, while shedding Gupta blood, became Indian themselves. Yes, the British were different, for they saw India as an inexhaustible gold mine whose resources were to be forever extracted. By the time India won its independence in 1947, its native institutions had been demolished, its economy deindustrialized, its trade network severed, and its people more deeply divided by caste and creed. In just 200 years of colonial rule, the India that once inspired the world was unmade. The halcyon days of India are over. She has been drained of all the wealth she once possessed, and her energies have been cramped by a sordid system of misrule. The deliberate bleeding of India by the British was so extreme that famed American scholar Will Durant referred to it as the greatest crime in all of history. So let's pull back the curtain and see what India was like before colonialism. In the 19th century, the American J.T. Sunderland wrote about the India that the British found when they arrived. India was a far greater industrial and manufacturing nation than any in Europe or Asia. Her textile goods were famous all over the civilized world. So was her exquisite jewelry and her precious stones. So was her pottery, her porcelains and ceramics. So were her fine works in metal, iron, steel, silver, and gold. She had great architecture, equal in beauty to any in the world. She had great merchants, businessmen, bankers, and financiers. She was not only a great shipbuilding nation, but had commerce and trade which extended to all civilized countries. That may seem like heavy-handed praise, but the record does show that pre-colonial India was a dominant manufacturing economy. Let's take a closer look at the textile, shipbuilding, and metalworking industries. India was a textile superpower for most of its long history. There were many textile centers in the subcontinent. Coastal Andhra was a block printing hub, for example, while Gujarat and Bengal were known for their high-end woven products. There was global demand for these items. In fact, India enjoyed a mind-blowing 25% share of the global textile trade by the mid-18th century. This thriving textile trade had knock-on effects for the entire economy. For example, the popularity of Indian textiles led to the creation of stable international distribution networks. By piggybacking on these networks, other Indian artisans could sell their goods worldwide at a reduced cost. Wow. As a result, many different industries flourished alongside the Indian textile industry. We know that international trade was conducted primarily along maritime routes, and so the Indian shipbuilding industry had developed into a behemoth too. A significant number of Indian ports were engaged in the shipbuilding industry: Dhaka, Masulipatam, Surat, Calicut, Quilon, and many, many others. Entire rural communities were involved in the production and processing of materials used to construct ships. Quality was paramount. Consider the Bengali merchant fleet in the early 17th century. The fleet consisted of nearly 5,000 ships, each capable of carrying up to 500 tons of goods. These ships were constructed in Bengali ports by native artisans who had the skills to craft elaborate wood, iron, and brass fittings. According to one British maritime observer, Indian vessels combine elegance and utility and are models of fine workmanship. Merchant contracts indicate that Bengali ships were much more durable than English ships. Bengali ships had an average lifespan exceeding 20 years, while English ships were not known to last more than 12. Quite a difference. India was a longtime pioneer in the global steel industry. As early as the 6th century CE, crucible-formed steel, which came to be known as Wootz or Damascus steel in the West, was being produced for export by Indian blacksmiths, particularly along the Malabar coast and in the Deccan. Arab and European officers regularly imported blades from India. While these blades were purchased as wartime implements, they were so robust and beautifully crafted that they also served as a mark of high status in times of peace. Though we've barely scratched the surface, it should already be clear that India was a manufacturing juggernaut, a thriving exporter of high-quality goods to markets throughout the world. How did the British manage to unmake all of that? The fundamental principle of the British has been to make the whole Indian nation subservient to the interests and benefits of themselves. And so, once the British took power, they changed the entire dynamic of the Indian economy to suit their own interests. The first step? Dismantling all native industry. To start, they established a legal monopoly over Indian textile goods and cut off the export market, which immediately disrupted long-standing trade links. Having now made themselves the exclusive buyers of Indian textiles, the British then changed the way that they paid for those goods. Instead of using foreign currency, they paid using the tax revenues extracted from India. The Indian economy stagnated and prices collapsed. Skilled artisans, who once fueled the vibrant Indian economic engine, were now significantly poorer and more restricted than ever before. And it didn't stop there. Soon enough, British manufacturers lobbied their government to completely eliminate the competition from the Indian textile industry. See, despite the restrictions imposed on Indian industry, British manufacturers were still finding it difficult to compete with Indian products. Company soldiers were sent to smash Indian looms. According to several different accounts, they even went around breaking the thumbs of weavers so that they could no longer ply their trade. But that's not all. To ensure that the Indian textile industry could not recover, adapt, or innovate itself back into relevancy, the British imposed an absurdly harsh 80% tariff. This had an immediate catch-22 trap effect. Exporting goods from India to the UK was now economically unviable. But remember, Indians were restricted from selling to anyone else. Similar restrictions were imposed on nearly every branch of manufacturing in India. India was reduced to being a mere exporter of raw materials, like cotton and metal ore, so that the British could sell finished products back to Indians at a premium. We conquered India as an outlet for the goods of Britain. I'm not such a hypocrite to say that we hold India for the Indians. The colonial deindustrialization process was so complete that by 1947, only 0.7% of India was employed in any form of manufacturing. But skilled workers had to go somewhere, do something. The British monopoly on industrial production drove Indian artisans, merchants, builders, and others into agriculture en masse. In the words of Dr. Charles Hall, India's population has been thrown back upon the soil because Britain's discriminating duties have ruined every branch of native manufacture. Rural wages cratered to historical lows, and in fact, the land itself could not sustain the influx of newly disenfranchised workers. Poor seasonal harvests and droughts gave way to catastrophic famines and mass poverty. With most Indians now converted into peasant cultivators, the British sought to exploit them further. They began to tax cultivators as the primary revenue source for the administration. Taxes were extreme, pegged at 50 to 80% of gross income, and calculated before the harvest. The result? Indian cultivators often owed more in taxes than they earned as income. The British knew how harsh this really was. They openly conceded that they were imposing the highest tax rates in the world, and that taxes were more than 3 times higher than they had ever been under Indian rulers. To add insult to injury, the British even bragged about it in Parliament. The Indians have been taxed to the utmost limit. Every province has been made a field for higher exaction, and it has always been our boast how greatly we have raised the revenue above that which the native rulers were able to extort. Colonial taxes were so burdensome that 2/3 of the population in directly ruled British areas fled to the hinterlands, where native Indian lords could at least minimally protect them from financial depredation. The millions who stayed behind could hardly afford to pay taxes, and the situation was worsened by the fact that the British did not negotiate tax payments. Horrors were perpetrated under the guise of sinless mathematical neutrality. Tax defaulters were confined in cages and exposed to the burning sun. Fathers sold their children to meet the rising rates. Vulnerable peasants were physically tortured to pay up, and when they didn't have the means to pay, the British confiscated their farmland for themselves. Tens of millions of landless peasants were created for the first time in Indian history. By the end of the 19th century, India was Britain's largest source of revenue by far, its largest purchaser of exports, and a source of highly paid employment for both British civil servants and soldiers, and they were all paid for by Indian taxes. Many British officials freely acknowledged the exploitative nature of the colonial enterprise. In fact, a Prime Minister of the UK, the Marquess of Salisbury, himself admitted, "As India is to be bled of money, the lancet should be directed to those parts where the blood is congested." And just like that, India and its people were bled dry.
All right, so we're gonna pause it there. And I'd like to pause to hear from you all, because this is, while this might be, you know, common knowledge, I think for those who have studied Indian history and have been part of that system, for us in the Caribbean, especially descendants, we're not too familiar with this history. So I want to pause there to see, to gauge some reaction and kind of hear what you all think or how you feel after looking at that. I guess I'll start with Anjani since I felt like this would directly answer her question. Does it? And how does it make you feel?
Teacher, yes, it does answer my question. I did know a little bit about the whole British rule in India and the impact it had on, I mean, at the time, the global climate at that time is a whole different era. And I know that our ancestors, they were living under very harsh conditions there. And I know that was what motivated them choosing to come. I mean, I can't foresee leaving everything behind to go to the unknown, especially when you look at the persons who would have come, persons who would have never left India, never left the borders of India to come halfway across the Caribbean or halfway across the world to come to this unknown land to do to choose working under these conditions. I always I think it's inspiring as much as it's scary, but sometimes you have to make a choice what's best for your family, what's best for your future and well, the generations to come. And well, if they didn't make that decision, we wouldn't be here. And I think we in the Caribbean, we've grown so much from our ancestors who sacrificed so much to come here under the conditions that they were living.
Thank you for sharing. And so we'll uh, dive a little bit deeper into what you're saying a little bit later on. But thank you for sharing that. I see a couple hands up. Sukhdeo's.
Teacher, everybody.
Sitaram.
Listening to that and how it happened, you can't help but build inside of you this anger and this rage and resentment towards the British for what they have done. Now saying that, I mean, it's our history, it's what happened, and it's something that we would just have to figure out how to live with it. Now, I remember when I had gotten the opportunity to speak at the BANA program that we were lucky enough to be a part of. I had said when I was going back to India for the first time, I was thinking about my grandfather, my forefathers, and how they would feel about knowing that their great-grandchild is now coming back to India, and what they had felt leaving India, coming to Trinidad for the first time. And now hearing this and what happened and why it gets a whole different mindset and understanding now of this is what they had gone through and how horrible their lives was. And the decision to leave India and now go to Trinidad, this is what it was based on. It really is very, very heartbreaking.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Trini Bridgelal.
So I wanted to share not so much my opinion, but what I saw comments during these past few days as we celebrated Indian Arrival Day. So and some were pretty disturbing. One of the comments was by a non-East Indian who said they came and they took our land, meaning that and at first I was upset about it, but then when I thought about it, it was when slavery ended, they got nothing. When indentureship ended, East Indians got land. So they have this sense that what the East Indians got, they should have gotten it. So that was one of the opinions. The other one that I heard that was disturbing was that because of the caste system, that East Indians became very poor. And because of that poverty, they came to the West Indies. And another one I heard was that Mahatma Gandhi sold out the East Indians, which created poverty, and this caused the East Indians to come to Trinidad. So, of course, I tried to comment and to correct as much as I could. I don't know if it would change the mindset in any way, but it's just 180 years we're celebrating of East Indian presence, and there's still so much misunderstanding connected to it, and how East Indians came here and how people view what East Indians have today. So I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And that is precisely why these conversations and in forums like this are important. We take it for granted that everybody understands what happened and that we're on a level playing field. But when you have persons who's grown up with this idea of Indian indentureship descendants for so long and spreading mass misinformation, then there's a need, like you're saying, Nadi, to correct and then to move forward. Why do we need to correct? We'll talk about that shortly, but you're seeing it firsthand, what it does to society when those types of toxic thoughts start to infiltrate a society. So yes, thank you for sharing that. One of the things that I thought about as well, on looking at that video was a lot of times when we think about India, or even when you hear people in the Caribbean speak about India, they would say, thank God my ancestors left there and came here, because look at what their state would have been in India. And again, the thought ends there. And there is no thought given to what caused all of that in India. Why was India in that state that forced them to leave and to come here? And so I felt like this background information was really, really important for us to have it, because it starts to paint that picture of what our ancestors' reality was as they had to make this decision to move forward. So with that, let's continue. So I'll share my screen once again. Let me make sure I'm sharing the right screen. Pausing it. Yeah. All right, awesome. So before we continue, let's regroup and see what the British, what their kind of trend has become. We see what has happened with them and the indigenous people, the Europeans as well, but right now we're dealing with the British. We've seen what their reputation has been with the African slaves and now with the Indians. So it's kind of their signature move as they're continuing to move forward. So Britain looked to India. Slavery has been abolished, and none of the other indentureship programs are working. None of them are lucrative. So Britain looks to India, and they see an opportunity to do what? To fix one problem they created with another problem that they created. They've created problems on both sides of the world, and they've said, let's fix one problem that we've created with another problem that we've already created. So slavery was now abolished, and they had a shortage of labor in the colonies. Plantation owners who were promised slave labor and wealth were now becoming very, very angry. And on the other side of the world, millions of Indians were starving due to the economic destruction that they themselves, the British, had caused. So their genius idea, let's take the starving Indians and send them to work on the colonial plantations. And so bold-facedly, they presented this as an opportunity to the Indian leaders and the impoverished people. And they said, we will help to get you out of poverty. They never said, or they never acknowledged that it was the very poverty that they themselves had created. And so as a result of this, the indentureship system, Indian indentureship system, was born. So what was the Indian indentureship system? In essence, the Indian indentureship system was a form of contracted labor where the Indians were paid wages in return for their labor, right? So the first major Indian indentureship experiment began in Mauritius in 1834. And seeing that it was going well, plantation owners in Guyana soon asked for Indian indentured laborers as well. And so in 1838, Guyana, the first in the Caribbean, received their first ship of indentured labor. Now, you'd see in the definition that these were legally binding agreements. Legally binding agreements. So while the contracts were legally binding, the colonizers made sure that the only people that they legally bound was the indentured laborers. There was no accountability on the part of the plantation owners. It legally bound the indentured laborers, making them easier to control. What followed? What do you think followed? Just kind of given the reputation and the precedent that the British have set, exploitation of the Indians. The harsh working conditions and the deplorable state of living was so obvious and brutal that even British activists protested, calling it slavery in disguise. So now receiving pushback against their own country, the British colonizers had to rethink their strategy. In 1845, they made some changes and adding official contracts that later became known as Gamitia agreements. Now, what you're seeing on the screen here is an actual contract. So this is Shiva's grandfather's contract when he came under this program to Trinidad in 1906. So what these contracts promised were wages, food, housing, and a return passage back to India after 5 years. But let's not take it from me, because on the flip side of this contract has all of the detailed terms and conditions that were being promised. So we're going to see what it says, and I'm going to ask Videsh to unmute. And because it is so tiny, Videsh has good eyes. He is going to help us read. So I want you to pay attention to what they were being promised, because we're going to compare that soon to what the actual reality was.
Sitaram, everyone.
Taram?
So the conditions of service and terms of agreements which the recruiter is authorized to offer on behalf of the agent to intending immigrants. Number 1, period of service. For male immigrants, 5 years from the date of allotment. For female immigrants, 3 years from the date of allotment. 2, nature of labor. Work in connection with the cultivation of soil or the manufacture of the produce on any plantation. Number 3, number of days on which the immigrant is required to labor in each week. Every day, excepting Sundays and authorized holidays. Number 4, number of hours in each day during which the immigrant is required to labor without extra remuneration. 9, inclusive of half an hour for rest and refreshment. 5, monthly or daily wages or task work rates. Able-bodied adults of and above 16 years of age shall be paid 1 shilling and half penny, which is at present equivalent to 12 annas and 6 vi for each day's work. Adults not able-bodied or minors of and above 10 years and under 16 years of age shall be paid 8 pence, which is at present equivalent to 8 annas for each day's work. And when performing extra work shall be paid in proportion for every extra hour of work. Wages earned will be paid fortnightly. If the immigrant be required to work by task instead of by time, the same wages shall be paid as to unindentured laborers on the same or other neighboring plantations, or to indentured laborers on the neighboring plantations, and such wages may be more, but shall not be less than the minimum wages payable for time work. Number 6, conditions as to return passage. The immigrant, on completing a continuous residence of 10 years in Trinidad and holding or becoming entitled to a certificate of exemption from labor, shall with family, if any, should they not be under indenture, or if under indenture, should commutation money have been paid to their employer, be provided with a return passage back to Calcutta on payment of 1/2 of the passage money in the case of men, and 1/3 in the case of women, provided that every such immigrant who is destitute or disabled shall, with dependents, be entitled to a free return passage. Persons who have previously proceeded to the colony and returned to India shall not be entitled to return passages. After completing a continuous residence of 5 years and holding or becoming entitled to a certificate of exemption from labor, the immigrant may return to India at his own cost. Blankets and warm clothing are supplied gratis on leaving India, but not for the return voyage. Number 7, other conditions. Full rations will be provided for adults and minors by the employer for 12 calendar months following the date of allotment, according to the scale sanctioned by the government of Trinidad at a cost of 3 pence, which is at present equivalent to 3 annas each daily, and to each infant under 10 years of age, 1/3 of a ration free of cost. Suitable dwellings will be assigned to immigrants free of rent, and such dwellings will be kept by the employer in good repair. Hospital accommodation with medical attendance, comfort, etc., will be provided free of charge to all immigrants under indenture and their families.
Thank you, Deshi. So, I mean, hearing this, that doesn't sound so bad at all, especially given what is happening in India at the time, right? That sounds, to me at least, it sounds pretty good. So, with this type of contract drawn up, the British went to some of the poverty-stricken regions in India, particularly Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, and Bengal. And in these areas, like we said, many of the Indians were facing poverty, famine, and unemployment, making them desperate for work. So this is what they're come with. So what I'm going to do now is put you into some discussion groups because I'd like for you all to discuss among yourselves and then come back and share. What would you do as somebody who is surviving within these conditions at this time in India and being faced with this opportunity to join this indentured labor program? What would you do? I see Shivani, you have your hand up.
Yes, I was just curious. Is there any reason there's a difference in the time frame between the men and the women as far as 3 years versus 5 years? I always thought it was just 5 years for everybody.
Yeah, the women were considered to be weaker, so they gave them the option to return faster than the men. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, awesome. So with that, let me now put you into some breakout rooms. So just give me 1 second. So what you're doing is you're going to discuss what would you do, and why would you make that decision. If everybody is saying they would join the program, I'd like for one person to be the devil's advocate and say, no, I'm not going to join the program, and make sure you're having a healthy conversation. So I'm going to put you in these groups for like 5 minutes, and then you'll come back and we will debrief. So you'll find yourself being moved shortly. All right. Rani, are you having difficulty joining your room? Welcome back. Welcome back. Everybody else should be joining in a couple seconds. All right, most people are back. One humble request for those who are off camera, please turn your cameras on. I think we had requested that cameras be on for today's session, so please oblige us. All right, who would like to share, kind of what those conversations were like and, what was interesting about the conversation?
Well, I will go first. I'll kick it off.
Okay.
My group was a really big group, unfortunately. I had myself, I had Miss Chandra, I had Jaya, and we had one other lady from Vancouver, Canada, who was from Guyana originally, a family from Guyana, but she's from Vancouver. The session was a little bit short, but was good. I know we are crunching time. But Chandra did express that her grandfather did not go back because he had a family and he already had land and established roots in Trinidad.
So
and
we
he
don't,
didn't.
so the question wasn't if they went back. The question is, would they come and what would they leave India and come to
Right.
the indentureship program? Yeah.
Yeah. So we answer both. If they will leave India and come, the answer would have been yes, because what they have and what they promise. What they had in writing, of course, is nothing to what they really experience.
Yeah.
So you have a nice, juicy contract, and you have famine, and you have nothing.
Mhm.
And to go back, Chandra say yes, she would remain in Trinidad. I also say yes, based on the condition.
So
I would remain.
let's not jump the gun. We'll get to that piece shortly. Let's for now talk about whether they would come, and then we'll get to
That
the
was it.
after. All right, thank you, Shiva, for sharing. Who else? Tila?
So our group, we had Indira and her family, the Trini Bridgelals, Shivani, and us. And we did also discuss both, but Nadira have it most eloquently, the way to put it, to go as to why we would not come.
Okay. So she's throwing Nadira under the bus.
So you're unmuted.
Yeah, you're unmuted.
I'm not sure if I'm answering both or if I'm just answering the why we would not come, but I'll answer that part and then hand over, right?
Mhm.
So what we were saying is that the Indians at that time, the only experience that they would have had with the British was one of pain and suffering, where the British would have exploited them physically, mentally, financially, all different ways. So this person or this group who you would have only experienced suffering from is coming and telling you, look, I have this new opportunity that would make your life better. When you have already created a sense of mistrust in you towards them.
Mhm.
So, you know what? Why would you believe them?
Yeah.
Why would you think that after all of this abuse that you are currently experiencing with them, that they would give you something better?
Yeah.
And for that reason, I think people would have said, no, I'm not going. They say a bird in the hand is worth more than the bird in the bush.
Mhm.
I'm suffering, but at least I know what I'm suffering with, the
Mhm.
conditions, versus I'm going somewhere else and I don't know what I'm going to be there.
Yes.
Might have influenced them. Those who said no, that they're not going.
That's awesome. I love the alternative viewpoint. Thank you. Neela?
Sitaram.
Sitaram.
In my group, we had Vidya, Trisha, Vivek, Neil, and myself. And just as Nadia explaining, from the picture we painted just now, we saw where we're living under extreme poverty. I have to sell my child to get through in life, you know. So given this contract where I'm getting work, I'm being paid for overtime, I'm assuming I'm getting, you know, a place to stay. I mean, that is already so much, you know. So the decision everybody made was to go. So why would I not go? It's like, who going to see about Aji? Who going to see about Nani? You know, I'm assuming that at that time they would have had to live like a community where you have so much different families living together, and they all had to, you know, whatever little they had to save and put together to live. So by everybody picking up and going, it's like, who's going to see about the older folks, you know, all that responsibility there, who's going to do that? So based on that is why I would not go.
Yeah, so thinking about the responsibilities, do you think, just coming off of that, that families probably would have separated then and would have said, you go, we will stay and take care of Aji and Nani, but you go and work for 5 years because that was the contract duration, and then and bring back some money, kind of like what's happening now in Trinidad and Guyana and so on, where somebody goes to the United States and works and helps the family back home. Do you think some of that would have happened, and so families would have probably gotten separated, right? And today,
Definitely.
a lot of people would ask us, you have family back in India? And we would be like, we would say, I'm sure I do, but no clue who they are, where they are, any of that. So that brings to light, you know, the fact that families would have gotten separated because of this idea of responsibility. Vidya?
Oh,
sorry.
Before, I just wanted to add before, quite recently I was talking to my dad, and he was telling me that his grandfather had came from India to settle in Trinidad. And while he was going back to India, he died on the boat. So similar to what you were saying there, I'm sure he would have, you know, wanted to go back to see his people and take back whatever, you know, he had.
Yeah. Thank you. Anjali? Oh, Vidya first and then Anjali.
So for me, I wouldn't come. As a female, I feel like and the way actually we were brought up with we were under our parents, and I would use the word rule. But as a woman, I would not have done it. I still don't understand why my grandfather did it. Again, but I wanted to say also Shiva's Aja and my Aja, they were on the same boat. Because he came on that night, 1906 was the last boat that came, right? Am I right?
1913.
1913? No, my Aja came in 1906. And so I guess they were on the same boat. And
but there were also a few boats that came in 1906.
Okay, so maybe not, but that's the same year. And that for me, I don't think as a woman that I would have done that. I would be wanting to be close to my siblings, my parents.
Yeah.
So and I had always said this to my dad, that my Aja was very rebellious, that he would just didn't say goodbye to his family, and he left on a boat and he just came.
Yeah.
So for me, no.
What I would ask you to think about is you're making that decision based on today's mindset, but think about whether you would have had a choice if your husband or somebody would have said we're going, whether you would have had that choice to say, no, I'm staying with my family, right? So
no, but my Aja came alone. He came with a friend. A friend.
Interesting. Thank you. Thank you for sharing, Vidya. Anjali.
Sitaram, everyone. Our group was the Houston Bridgelals, Vrinda and Ronnie, together with Vivek and I. Our discussion it mirrored a lot of the previous contributions. Pretty also brought up that same point that Nadi did, that the mistrust of the British would have been paramount in a refusal, because if they are so difficult and untrustworthy in India, why would you trust what they were saying? So the discussions on no was similar. Fear of the unknown, persons who are older and medically unfit to travel, would, those things would have the no. But in the yes column, why would they say yes to come? As Freddie pointed out, if you have a family who is starving, hungry, you would do anything to, even if it's a promise of a better life. And so for younger persons who may have had children who have the ability to travel, the yes would have been easier than, let's say, someone who is older who'll say, you know what, I've been here all my life already. I'll just die here. And, you know, as we were closing off our discussion, the promise of return. I mean, even though they may have been falling for a trick, you're thinking that if they say we can come back, it means that if we go and we don't like it, we could probably change our minds, not realizing that where you're going is so far away that the thought of even going back, as Vidya said, her grandfather died on the way back because it was such a long trip. So the promise of return would have been, all right, well, you know, we could go and try it out.
Yeah.
And then if we don't like it, we can come back.
Yeah.
So that would have been one of the reasons for a yes.
Yeah. There's also a mindset of, can it get worse than it is now? Like where we are, you know, can it possibly be worse than that? Thank you, Anjali. Anjali, and then we'll continue going forward.
Teacher, so my group was Indra, Shelley, Chitra. I feel like I'm forgetting somebody else. Nandini, right? And Nandini. And since none of them raised their hands, I guess I'll be the one laughing. Oh my God. Right? I'll be the one to speak. So, as I would have said before on the previous groups, the deal seemed lucrative. The timing seemed right because we are there, we are desperate, we want to go. We don't want to go, but we need to go. That is the mindset. I mean, we're down to selling our children. So, no, we can't take more of this. We want a future. We have to take this risk. So that's the yes. The no would have been the same thing, the mistrust with the British. You presented to us a contract, an original contract, written in English to a bunch of non-English speaking persons who, could you really trust the translator? Most of them, and as the point was made, were illiterate in the sense of not knowing Western languages, right? So they were literally putting their thumbprint onto something that they didn't really understand what they were getting into. Apart from the physical circumstances being unknown, even the promise that is being made there on that paper, they were doing that would have been a no. If we discussed that would have been a no. And of course, the sense of community, most of these people, if you looked at the villages that they were coming from, very strong village community culture, very strong extended family setting. Same thing. If all the young ones are leaving and moving on, would there have been really anything to go back to?
Right.
You know, would they have been welcomed back into their villages, into their home? Would they be considered traitors when they come here and they have to adopt these new culture, new religion? How do they go back to what they were leaving? So that would have been our no.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much. Great conversation, great discussion.
Just one comment.
Go ahead.
The contract was written in 4 different languages.
Okay.
English just happened to be one on the top, but there were
Yes.
3 different Indian
That's
languages that follow.
That's true. That's true. We could share
And
this.
they had translators, and they had the head of the village translating to them. So
Yes.
they were fully aware of the contract.
That's true, but I think the point that she's raising is one of trust, which is the same one
Yes.
that Nadi's raising. It's can we trust this? Can we trust that it's saying what it's going to be, or can we trust that, you know, can we even trust the British, right? And so I think that's the bigger point that she's raising. Ronnie, I see a hand.
May
Let's
I
make it quick because we need to keep moving. But go ahead.
Sitaram, just to add to the conversation, many years ago, I visited India actually, and I was a part of a very similar conversation about indentureship and the link across the world. And one of the things, a lot of Indians, they don't recognize indentureship, or they don't fully really know what indentureship is. But you tell them about Girmit or Girmitia, and they automatically they understand and they know everything. They know what it is. And the reason why is that contract that you all refer to was such a huge part of the entire indentureship process that it literally named us to the Indian community moving forward. We and as I mean our ancestors who would have moved forward, and even these present generations, we are known to the Indian community current day as Girmitia or Girmit, and that word would have come from agreement, so which would have been understood by the Indians as agreement, and then it turned into Girmit, and that's how, well, from my understanding, that is how we are now known as Girmitia, because of that contract itself would have had such significance to our ancestors, because yes, there was an entire layer of trust and issues and whatever, but they also saw the contract as a way of, the British claimed to have so much dignity in the way they do things, and they wanna standardize operations and all these big talk, and then that's how they got to them. They're like, okay, well, we are going to honor the contract if you honor your end. And so that's why again, one of the things that I would have understood from that entire contract.
Yeah, and we have with us Dr. Nandlal, and he will be sharing with us kind of some from the Indian perspective as well, what he's learned. We really need to move forward because we have a lot more to cover. So I'm going to keep us moving. All right. So can you all see my screen again? Yeah. Okay. All right. So initially, now a lot of time the question comes up about who came as indentured laborers, right? There's a lot of conversation that there were only low caste, and I'm using that in inverted, air quotes. People, they were the only ones that came to the West Indies, and initially, many laborers from poor and disadvantaged backgrounds, like we've been saying, joined the indentureship program. But as time passed, merchants and Brahmins also joined the system, as they too were being experiencing financial difficulties and experiencing social pressures in India. So once they arrived at the port of Calcutta, now we're moving into kind of the journey. They were made to present themselves for a medical check. So somebody mentioned, the elderly probably would have made the decision not to go. Well, even if they made the decision to go and they got to the port of Calcutta, they would have been refused. You had to pass medical checks. And so because of the backlash that the British had already received because of slavery, they made the Indians stand in front of officers and verbally declare that we are embarking on this journey of our own free will. So they had to make that verbal statement. And once they did that, they were then promptly packed into overcrowded ships at the port of Calcutta and sent into the unknown. As soon as they got on board the ships, reality started hitting really hard. So a lot of conversation here about trust and whether the British will hold up their end of the bargain. As the indentured laborers got on the ships and they started observing the deplorable conditions of the ship, that became very, very obvious. It was severely overcrowded and really more fit for cargo and for animals than for human beings. Laborers were housed below deck in cramped quarters known as the coolie deck, which was divided into sections. So there were single men at the front, there were families at the middle, and a single woman at the back. The space was dark and poorly ventilated, and often it was coated inside the ships with coal tar, to prevent moisture from outside from the ocean coming in. And that made it extremely difficult to keep it clean. What the indentured laborers were promised was a few days of adventure on the ocean. And remember, for many of them, this would have been, I think Anjani said, their first time on a boat. But what they soon realized was that the journey was long and it was brutal. The few days on board turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. And on average, it took a ship 103 days to get from India to the Caribbean. 103 days. People were, like we said, were crammed into tiny spaces and they were barely able to move. Many of the travelers, they became sick. They suffered from seasickness, dysentery, bronchitis, and other illnesses. And despite, going through those medical checks before they boarded the ships, there were great outbreaks of cholera and measles and mumps. These were common and led to high mortality rates on the ship. Now, imagine the smell on there. Rotting food, sickness, seawater, sweat, vomit, etc. We can use our imagination. We don't need to say all the things. But the journey was so treacherous that it became known as crossing the Kala Pani, or the Black Waters. Many of us were familiar with this term. Some laborers, it is said that they became overwhelmed by the conditions and they jumped overboard thinking maybe I could try to swim back to India. Some of them said this is hopeless and they committed suicide by jumping overboard. It is said that between 1834 and 1917, which is the period of indentureship, 1.4 million Indians left India under this indentureship program. And sadly, not all of them arrived at their destination. Between 5 to 10% of those who left India died before reaching their destination. By the time the survivors landed in Guyana and Trinidad and Suriname and Fiji and Mauritius and South Africa, they knew that the reality was going to be a far cry from what was stated on those agreements. But by that time, it was too late for them to turn back. One thing, however, was certain, and that was that they had formed a bond with others who had gone through this journey on the ship. And they began referring to each other as Jahaji Bai, or Brotherhood of the Boat. And there's a beautiful song that was composed about this. So where did they go? Where were the Indians taken? The short answer is that they were taken anywhere the British had colonized, right? So including colonies with sugar plantations or other industries that required hard manual labor. Like we said, between 1845 and 1917, 1,432,600 Indians left India as part of the indentureship program. And so if you look at this illustration, it shows the distribution of the workers and where they went. The size of the circle represents how many went to each particular colony. And as you can see, the largest population went to Mauritius, and in the Caribbean, it was Guyana that received the most indentured workers simply because of the size of the land and the plantations that needed to be worked at that time. So they've arrived on the plantations. They've realized this is not going to be easy. Indian indentured workers went through tremendously tough, often brutal conditions under British colonial rule and their plantation owners. And I'm calling them owners because even though they were said to be free, they were treated as though they were property. Life wasn't just difficult, it was exploitative, it was unfair, and in many ways it resembled slavery. The laborers, they experienced beatings and brutal discipline. So plantation owners didn't just expect hard work, they demanded total obedience. And workers would even be whipped, beaten, and starved if they didn't work as hard as the plantation owners thought that they could. They would be locked away for small mistakes that they would make, and overseers would make sure that they kept pushing them to their limits. They lived in cramped barracks, many times the same barracks that the slaves would have lived in. And disease spread fast. Clean water was a luxury. They didn't have clean water to drink. And many of them suffered from poor health and malnutrition. And there was a high degree of death rates simply because they weren't given the proper care. So Neela mentioned that somebody died on the way back to India. Well, some of them didn't even make it through indentureship because of the conditions of indentureship. Many workers never fully understood the contracts, like we all discussed just now. And plantation owners, they took full advantage of that. They cut wages unfairly, and they kept workers in a state of perpetual debt. Some were never paid at all, despite years of hard labor. There was no freedom, and they were trapped on plantations. Once the indentured laborers arrived, they were not free to leave. And if they tried, then they were hunted down, and they were punished, and they were forced back to work. Even when their contracts ended in some instances, they were forced to stay on longer because their plantation owners refused to let them go. Women especially endured terrible abuse, often becoming targets for plantation overseers. With little legal protection, many of them were forced into relationships or they were sexually assaulted by the plantation owners without consequence. Families were even sometimes separated, and this made women even more vulnerable. And if workers complained about any of this, the British authorities simply ignored them. Plantation owners controlled the courts, and so justice was impossible. Indentured Indians and their descendants were seen as disposable labor. Why? Because India had a never-ending supply of labor, and they had no real protection under colonial law. So let's continue forward as we learn more about some of the first-hand experiences of this.
These are some
Are you all hearing?
plantations in British colonies that operated just 100 years ago. Some of these workers are enslaved Africans. Some are indentured servants from India. Can you tell the difference? After slavery was abolished, Britain replaced its enslaved workers with a cheap alternative: indentured servants. In this new system, millions of people were coerced into signing away their rights for 5 to 10 years at a time. This system is not ancient history. Some of its survivors could still be alive.
बहुत दुख तकलीफ काटे के पड़ा। अरे हम गोरा लोग लाश से मारे इसे। अच्छा। हाँ। गोरा लोग लाश से मारे, काम नहीं करो, चाबुक लगावे गाड़ी पर। हाँ। कोई सुनवाई नहीं। गिरमिट तुम्हारी।
These workers became bound to overseas employers where they endured harrowing abuse and exploitation for the duration of their contract.
I would call the system of indenture a hidden history, and it is and has been deliberately obscured from our national narrative.
Maria Caladine's great-grandfather was recruited from India through this exact system. He ended up toiling at a sugar plantation in British Guyana for years on end. After seeing how her family's past had been buried, Maria decided to specialize in the study of Indian indenture.
We know about it because the British kept the receipt. They are there. All the receipts are there. They are there for everyone to see.
British colonizers took portraits of these workers after taking them from India to work in overseas colonies. Most would never return. Have a look at this record of Indian immigrants. These are the names of Indians who signed an indenture contract and boarded a ship from Calcutta on December 2nd, 1903.
It's an agreement between you and your employer that you will work for a particular number of years.
As soon as they signed that contract, the indentured worker lost much of their freedom. They were treated like human cargo, shipped around the world and bound to their employer for the time period of their contract. They were bought, sold, overworked, and abused in ways far too similar to slavery. Here's how it all went down. By the end of the 1800s, the British Empire was growing to the biggest the world had ever seen. And the natural resources of the colonies, like sugar and cotton, earned the colonizers a lot of money. But labor costs started eating into Britain's massive profits after slavery was abolished. And that's when the British brought in indentured Indians. There were more than 3 million people like Maria's great-grandfather taken from their homes and placed on ships heading to British colonies. The overall trade for these cheap laborers replaced nearly a quarter of the Atlantic slave trade.
What has taken place is a retelling of the history of the 19th century that focuses on the abolition of the slave trade and lauds those involved in the abolition of the slave trade, but does not draw attention in any way to the fact that the system of slavery was replaced by a system which was very brutal, really cruel, and lasted into the 20th century.
The vast majority of indentured workers were from India. As a result of indenture and additional migration, pockets of the Indian community can now be found in nearly every corner of our globe. Over 32 million people of Indian origin live outside of India today, the world's largest diaspora.
India might actually be a kind of replacement for Africa. Think of this from the planters' point of view. They can't imagine a world that would deny them a source of labour, cheap, malleable labour.
In 1838, the first Indian indentured labourers arrived in Guyana, and that was really the beginning of the system of Indian indenture.
Some labourers were forced or kidnapped, but others signed on voluntarily, especially during famine caused by British colonial rule. but most didn't know what they were signing up for. Picture yourself as Maria's great-grandfather, Khaladin, who was living in Pipra, India. Wages are at an all-time low. The class system is not working in your favor. Famine plagues your village. Recruiters employed by the British boast about the opportunity of indenture, guaranteeing high wages in return for a 5-year labor contract.
They frequently lied about what the terms of the indenture contract were, the distance of the place that people were travelling to, and the nature of the work that they would have to perform.
You can't read or write, but they tell you the contract provides round-trip passage to Calcutta, India, where you put in light labour in exchange for great wealth to bring back to your family. Like more than 2 million other Indians, you stamp your finger and take the deal.
In 1886, my great-grandfather was recruited in Gonda. He was taken to Faizabad. From then, he was taken to Calcutta as an indentured labourer.
What they didn't tell you is you're not really going to Calcutta. You're transferred from depots to shipyards, perhaps told your final destination would be Sri Lanka, but your ocean voyage keeps going and going. The ship itself is rancid, and you are crowded alongside parcels of rice, wheat, and hundreds of other laborers deep within the cargo deck.
Your voyage could have been one that was fraught with deaths from cholera, for example, typhoid, dysentery. It would have been quite traumatic for the immigrants.
You are lucky to survive the diseases that kill roughly 1 in 5 of your fellow passengers. Your peers bond over the shared trauma and call themselves the Jahaji Bhai, or Brotherhood of the Boat. 3 months later, you arrive in an unfamiliar land, and someone tells you it is known as British Guyana, a British colony thousands of miles away from home.
He left Calcutta for Guyana, and he indentured for 2 periods of 5 years on 2 estates in Demerara.
This arrival story is way too familiar for the tens of millions of descendants of Indian indenture. Hundreds of thousands of people were taken from China, Japan, and Polynesia as well, forming an extracted community known as coolies, a term that's now an offensive slur. The laborers were shipped across 19 of Britain's colonies, namely in the Caribbean and South Africa. The Dutch and French also took advantage of the cheap labor for their own plantations. Indentured labor was used to cultivate sugar, cotton, and tea, as well as endless train tracks. As early as the 1840s, British officials were calling this a new system of slavery.
The vast majority would never see India again, and would end their lives working in cane fields on the other side of the world.
Indentured workers endured back-breaking work and were whipped and abused by white authorities. Many of them were even housed in the same barracks as formerly enslaved people. Indentured women were sexually abused by white overseers and sometimes assigned to an Indian man as his housemate and sexual partner.
There is a deliberate kind of denial of anything which does not meet the description of enslaved or free. These binaries are not helpful to people who are trying to express or explain what the system of indenture was. There are conditions of unfree labour that exist between these 2 states, and we must look at them, we must see them, they're part of our history.
And what happened when their indenture contracts ended?
You could then choose to accept a return voyage home to India, or you could again accept a further bounty and stay in the colony. And that's what the majority of people chose to do.
But why would anyone choose to remain indentured? Even after years of laboring, some people didn't earn enough money to bring back home. Others feared they would be shunned when they got back to India, accused of abandoning their family.
So from India, people were taken to Mauritius, to Trinidad, to Guyana, to Fiji, to St. Lucia, Grenada, South Africa, Malaysia. The system was huge, so over 2 million people were part of it. And it has left, obviously, a huge diaspora because the majority of people didn't return in those places. They are a remarkable people because the story of indenture is a story of against all odds survival. And it is a story of great sacrifice.
The trauma lasted lifetimes. In British Guyana, it took generations before descendants of the first indentured laborers were able to get off the plantation, find work, or own property of their own. And British colonizers didn't stop there. In Trinidad, British Guyana, and South Africa, the British inflamed tensions between formerly enslaved Africans and Indians. sowing divisions that continue to plague former colonies.
So we are still able to see the legacies of colonialism to that extent, that they are part of the politics in those countries still today.
The indenture system didn't last forever. Indians in British colonies resisted their colonial oppressors for several decades. Although they didn't realize it, resistance efforts across the Indian diaspora culminated almost simultaneously in the early 1900s. In South Africa, individual workers rebelled on their plantations through desertion or suicide. Mahatma Gandhi later joined the Indian South African resistance movement, leading this major strike in 1913. In Fiji, indentured workers had the highest rates of suicide, using it as a form of resistance. In British Guyana, collective organizing ranging from demonstrations to resistance literature shook the nation. Some indentured workers took to writing in Guyanese newspapers to protest their abuse.
I don't think that the British have ever apologized. There is a very violent way of erasing somebody's history without it seeming to be violent, which is just not to talk about it, just not to acknowledge it.
Britain finally outlawed indentureship in 1917, but the system left behind a monumental legacy. Millions of South Asians were scattered across far corners of the world in a multi-generational Indian diaspora. Descendants of indenture in Suriname, Mauritius, British Guyana, and Trinidad cultivated a thriving Indo-Caribbean community. Indian South Africans launched their own political parties and joined in anti-apartheid efforts alongside Black South Africans. The coastal city of Durban, South Africa, became home to the largest population of Indians outside of India and is acclaimed for its Indian culinary scene. Assimilation was bittersweet for Indian migrants. They wanted to hold on to their cultural heritage, but colonial policies made this harder. In some places, it was punishable to speak Hindi. In others, Indians were not allowed to go to school or get jobs without first converting to Christianity.
I am sure that every indentured family has stories like mine, and I wish that we could just have some sense of, the tragedy of it and also the remarkable nature of the people who survived it.
Today, indentured servitude may be a forgotten or even buried history, but many of the tens of millions of descendants want us to know their story. These are some plantations in British.
All right. So would you stay or would you return? And I know that some of you started having these conversations already. I think she put it really well. The winds of change were blowing again. Mahatma Gandhi, as well as other Indian nationalists, they were all protesting this idea of slavery in disguise, growing international criticism, tremendous pressure on the British until they were forced on March 12, 1917, through the Defense of India Act, to end Indian indentureship. The last Indian indentureship contract expired on January 1st, 1920. So for the laborers who had completed their contracts, the choice was, do we stay or do we go? They were offered 10 acres of land in exchange for their return passage back home. So what did they do? 80% of them chose to stay. So if we look at this chart, we'll see kind of what that looked like. The reason being that it wasn't a simple choice that they needed to make. Many of them, would remember, had little or no savings because they were purely surviving on the plantations. Additionally, they remembered the conditions back home. India was still struggling under British rule, and so they thought, what is the point of going back to that? They would still be returning to a life of poverty. Many of them also remembered what the journey from India on those ships were like, and they thought we can't survive another one like that, and so they chose to stay. And additionally, many of them had built families and communities in these colonies, and so 80%, like we said, chose to stay, and they became the first generations of Indo-Caribbean, Indo-Fijian, and Indo-African communities, which created some of the largest Indian diaspora communities in the world. Like she mentioned in the video, life after indentured labor was strenuous for the Indians. Many were making a living was extremely tough for many of them. They weren't able to find jobs. The land they received, remember that 10 acres of land they were promised? Well, some of them got nowhere close to that. And on top of that, the land was poor and difficult to farm. But what did they do? They, instead of giving up, they worked hard doing jobs they didn't like until they could save money and eventually buy their own land to grow crops. There were education barriers, and many Indian descendants, they had no access to proper education, and so they were stuck doing plantation work. So what did they do in response to this? They made sure their children got educated, knowing that that would be the key to a better life. And over time, many of the children of indentured laborers, they became doctors and lawyers and business owners, and they broke free from this life of hard manual labor. In Trinidad, for example, Indo-Trinidadians who focused on schooling led to talented minds like V.S. Naipaul, who won the Nobel Prize in Literature. Government jobs and higher education was limited, but many found success by starting businesses and becoming leaders. Indo-Trinidadians established family-run businesses like Charon's Bookstore and SM Jalil and Sasha's Cosmetics. These may sound familiar to some of us. And Indo-Guyanese farmers built rice and sugar industries, creating wealth outside of colonial jobs. In politics, they had very little or no advocates in government. And so that meant that they had no voice. But instead of accepting unfair treatment, they formed groups. They fought for better representation, and slowly they gained political power. This also meant that they were able to push for religious freedom so they could practice their faith without discrimination. In Guyana and Trinidad, we know leaders like Chedi Jagan and Bade Sagan Maharaj, who spoke up for Indo rights and helped improve education and job opportunities. One of the biggest threats to the population was to their religious and cultural identity. They were pressured to assimilate into the culture, to abandon their culture altogether. They were pressured to convert to Christianity, to access better jobs and education. But many resisted, still finding ways to succeed. And so instead of relying on missionary schools, this is a story many of you are familiar with. Indo descendants created Hindu and Muslim schools themselves to ensure that their children could learn without pressure to convert. In Trinidad, the Sanatan Dharma Mahasabha established Hindu primary and secondary schools. And today, Trinidad has 54 Hindu primary schools and 8 Hindu secondary schools, 15 Muslim primary schools, and 6 secondary schools. They also pushed for the recognition of festivals like Diwali and Eid in Trinidad and Suriname and Guyana. In Trinidad today, we have 92 registered Hindu temples, 9 Indian formatted radio stations, as well as Hindu and Indian television stations. So through hard work and resilience over 180 years, Indo descendants carved out thriving communities while holding on to their traditions. This is one of my favorite slides. And so as you look at it, you see how we go from, our ancestors went from a state of surviving to a state of thriving. With every obstacle, every struggle, every challenge, they sacrificed, they persevered, and they found solutions, keeping God and faith in their community at the center. Indo descendants didn't just survive, they thrived. Through sheer determination, they overcame adversity and they built strong, successful communities. And at every juncture, they turned hardship into opportunity. For those of us on this call today, this is who we are, and this is the stuff that all of us are made of. Every single one of us, either by blood or by association. Remember this chart? We looked at it earlier. Let's look at what the numbers are today, 180 years later. Guyana, approximately 40% of the population, or 330,000 people, are of Indian descent. In Trinidad, 35.4%, which is 572,000 persons. In Mauritius, almost 1 million Indian descents. In addition to this, descendants of Indian indentured laborers didn't just stay in the colonies where they were placed, but they migrated throughout the world, like we saw in the video, spreading their unique history, their culture, and their practices. So for example, the Caribbean Indian diaspora in the United States as part of the broader West Indian population which is estimated at around 3.1 million people. Many Caribbean Indians trace their roots to Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, and Suriname. And we know that they've established vibrant communities in places like New York, Florida, and New Jersey. So the question is, why does this matter today? Why does this matter today? And so I'll ask you all to pause to reflect for a minute. And while you're doing that, we have a very special guest with us today. He didn't join as a guest, but knowing that Dr. Nandlal was going to be with us today, I couldn't resist this opportunity to ask him to speak. Dr. Nandlal Singh, he originally is from the beautiful city of Varanasi in India, and now he resides in Colleyville, Texas. He has a deep passion for Indian indentureship history. He's dedicated to exploring the struggles and the resilience of indentured laborers and how their journey shaped the generations across the world. Through his work, he helps to keep their stories alive and helping others to understand and appreciate their lasting impact. Dr. Nandlal has been a friend, a mentor, a partner to our community of Indian indentured descendants, not just in the United States, but throughout the world. And he's embarked on a search to learn and to understand the journey of what he calls the forgotten Videsias. And I always tell him every time he says that, thank you for finding us. I'd like to invite at this time Dr. Nandlal to share some of his reflection with us on why this is important.
Thank you, Taraji. Thank you. This is very emotional. Forgotten Videsia, indeed. For your audience, so first of all, this is quite an eye-opening session that I've had, and I've been thinking about the Indians, the East Indians who came, the first generation who are here, like me, that came in the 60s and 70s, and now we have become grandparents, and we got the third generation over here. Your presentation, if I could get access to, would be something that I would definitely go to different groups and insist that they watch, they spend time, understand that. There's so much to say and share with this group. Is this the one of a kind, or this is part of some series of sessions that we got?
It was intended to be one of a kind just because, you know, we're observing 180 years, but also because we've been seeing the need to reposition and reinforce the message even to us who our audience, who are descendants of East Indian indentureship. But if there's a need, we can repeat it, or we can.
I hope you create a capsule version of this, maybe 30 minutes, 45 minutes. I would definitely get quite a few East Indians to watch this and be enlightened. This is something that we all must know. One of your audiences said that a lot of people know Girmitias and so forth. It took me 55, 60 years to find out the word Girmitia, and I consider myself to be pretty well in tune with all these things, and we have never been taught. There's some sort of anathema that don't talk about all those things that happen. I come from a place, when Shivaji mentioned that his grandfather arrived here in 1906, my grandfather asked my father, who was 14 years old, to leave Banaras and go and find a job somewhere with one of the other villagers to go to Bombay. And people from Eastern UP and Western Bihar, which is the main source of all the indentured labor to different islands, they were in dire need of jobs. The land were owned by landlords, otherwise known as zamindars, and people were heavily in debt. As a result, they were indentured labor right there in India to their zamindars, that all your family members did nothing but to become servants of the zamindars. So most of the families would have as many sons as they could get just for survival. So what happened was The only option was either work for the landlord or send some of your kids to Calcutta or Bombay or even Burma. And fortunately, the railroad track that came from Delhi and Bombay went to Calcutta through Banaras. So most of the people just get on the train, just get on the train. They were very Mavericks type. People were very courageous. Just go get on the train and it will go to Calcutta. And then when you land there, you will find something. And I know that I was brought up in my village, and some of the pictures that I have been seeing, and some of the names, my sister's, cousin sister's name is Hiravati. All the names that I see, these are all the names that still are there in my village. And as I mentioned to you, Taraji and Shivaji, that I would love to take a busload of people to my village and show as to what the villages were. And they're still like what they were in 1880, 1900 and 1910. Not much has changed in certain areas, and you can relate to that. So people went to Calcutta not knowing what they were expecting. They went to Burma, they went to Bombay. So the ones that went to Bombay, they got stuck there. But the ones that went to Calcutta got recruited to go and get on the ship for 1 day trip to Andaman, Nicobars, otherwise known as Kalapani, and you will come back with a lot of money. And they were all uneducated people with the thumbprints, that's all. And they trusted that, it was very easy to place your thumbprint on a piece of paper and get on the ship. And back home in the villages, they didn't expect you to come back for 3-4 years. So if you didn't show up, if you didn't write, of course they couldn't write, they were not worried. They said that one day they will come back and they'll show up. Some of them did not, the ones that went to Calcutta. I know that from our village, we lost 2 people. And I know for sure that they got on the ship and never to come back. And the story goes around that they got kidnapped in Calcutta and they got murdered, killed, or whatever happened, or they just died. But the people who went to Bombay, they struggled. Bombay didn't have the port of exit from there to islands. It was only Calcutta. So I come from the same thing. I'm tracking my journey the way Shivaji is tracking. If my father had gone to Calcutta with one of the villagers, probably I would be in Trinidad, Guyana somewhere. I'll be in the same condition, same boat. But this title of these Bhojpuri people being not only survivors, later on thrivers. My father, who went after 5th education, did very well with his brothers, and they've created a very well-to-do empire and everything. So I know that wherever they went, they were survivors, and they pursued. It may have taken a couple of more generations, and they will continue, and they're doing that. There's so much to talk about, to share the 180 years of history that I've seen in Guyana and Mauritius and Trinidad. I missed my trip to Suriname because of the riots in Guyana earlier in the month of May, but I will be going there soon, and then Fiji, collecting a lot of information, and I'm finding a strong consistency about these forgotten Videsias and the route that you all's families have taken versus what we have taken. If going to Bombay, now Punjab and Burma is of course now out of question, Calcutta, it is still happening. It is still happening. We are not out of the woods yet here. There are still people in those villages. They are looking for jobs. The only difference is that they are educated. They don't have to be, they can read the contract, they can read the papers, and they can make a decision as to where and there are also sources now. They can go to Bangalore, they can go to Chennai, they can go to Delhi, Kashmir, and other options are available. They don't have to get on the ship unless it's going to Canada or UK or Australia or so. So very intriguing. I think I want my children have come to know about my passion, but our grandchildren, I don't know whether they would have any appreciation of all these things, the journeys that we have gone through, that we are traversing. It's something that we ought to know. I commend the people from Caribbeans going through all those things, watching while I can relate to, but just the sheer fact that for 103 days they will be on that ship. And I saw the replica of the ship in Berbice in Guyana, and some documentaries and so forth. It is something that we have to teach our children. We have to share with them, and we have to share with them in an objective, without being sugar-coated. It should be shared as is.
Mhm.
So thank you for the opportunity. I hope that you have part 2 of this. I will definitely be attending and bringing more people. What a service you have provided.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nanlal.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, so with those words, I want to turn it over to all of you now. I've given you quite a bit of information. Some you probably were familiar with already. Others you have new perspectives on them. My question to you is why is knowing this important? Sukhdev?
So when we had our breakout room, I said to them, we were very lucky that in our breakout room, we had 3 of us who had gone to India and gone to the ports of Calcutta, where our forefathers left from. And I remember that day being very, very, very emotional. Now, on that trip, we had gone.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm just showing what you're talking about.
Oh, no, Suresh muted me, so that's why I was waiting. Yeah, on that trip, we had gone to Ayodhya, which is close to where our forefathers from. So we saw the journey that they had taken to get to where the port of Calcutta is. And just standing in that place, I remember all of us just cried. And honestly, right now, I'm just looking at it, I can cry again. The emotions of standing there and understanding what our forefathers must have gone through to get there and to get on that boat and to get to whatever country they were going to. Ours is Trinidad, of course. It's very, very, it brings a sense of, I want to do better. I need to make them proud. I need to stand up and say their names loudly and let the world know that this is what they have done for us. And, I am so proud of my forefathers. I don't know what decision, why they made that decision to get on that boat, but we need to do better and we need to make them proud of us.
Yeah. Thank you so much indeed. Chitra?
Yeah, why it's important to know this is every one of us need to have an identity. It's a part of us. The way it is right now, this community who we're in, we're basically invisible. We're not in those boxes that you check where you are or anything like that. Nobody knows our history. And we get lumped into a group of people does not even have anything in common with us.
Yeah.
So it's important that we rise and be known, identify ourselves, hold on to that.
Mm-hmm. Which box do you check, Chitra, when they ask what is your ethnicity?
Other.
Yeah, because we're not represented on the form.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, Pradeep or Videsh?
Yeah, Sitaram, everybody.
Sitaram.
So we were having a conversation yesterday about this same topic, and we were talking about, why our Ramayana is so important to our community. And we were talking about how difficult our days used to be, our forefathers' days used to be. And at night, when they were winding down the day, they would come together. And they had the harmonium and they had the dolak and they had, somebody find an old piece of iron somewhere and they stretched it out and they made a dantal and they had the majira. And this is what they used. The Ramayana was so important.
Mm-hmm.
This is what they used to come together. And listening to this presentation today, I kept wondering, our culture is so strong, right? I look at everybody else that came to Trinidad, and no other culture kept no other group of people kept their culture the way Indian people kept their culture, right? But why didn't we keep our language? You know, it's such a strange thing that we didn't keep our language.
Mm-hmm.
And listening to our presentation today, I realized that there was such a strong move against the Indian people to get rid of that language so that they could control us. That is why our forefathers wasn't able to keep that. We had to get rid of that so that we could conform to what they wanted. And that's why the rest of us couldn't, keep that.
Yeah, that was definitely part of it. The other part of it was that, Shiva and I have had these conversations often. He would say, like in his house, his parents would speak to each other in Bhojpuri, but when they talk to the children, they talk to them in English. Why? Because that is how the children would succeed in school and in the workplace. So they would thinking they were doing something good for us, they would speak to their children and not pass on the Bhojpuri language, which is what most of our ancestors would have spoken. So in order to access school, in order to access jobs, you had to be English speaking. And so it was one of the casualties. I guess our ancestors thought, well, this is, of everything else, we're willing to give this up, maybe because they thought it's something that we could reclaim later on. Your thought about...
It's amazing that they were able to thread that needle, though, that they gave us everything else.
Yeah.
And yet they didn't, they were able to not give us that. I don't know how they did it, but it's amazing that they did that.
Yeah. Shiva's family also has one of the palm leaf Ramayan manuscripts. So when the indentured laborers were going to the islands, they weren't allowed to take scriptures. So they would divide each one of the manuscripts into chapters and they would distribute it among themselves. And the plan was when they got to where they were going, they would find each other and put it back together. And that is how these villages came together, and they would start having Ramayan satsangs below the trees and all of that. And that is how they formed a sense of community. So when you hear some of the ingenious ways that our ancestors used to take the culture to Trinidad, to maintain it and to keep it, again, not just surviving, but thriving, it really takes a lot of resilience. Yeah.
I also have something.
Go ahead, Deshi.
I would be considered first generation in America, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So being the first generation in America, it's kind of hard to like have a connection to our history because, well, first of all, I was born in the US Virgin Islands, so I never had any connection to Trinidad. So I never really had any knowledge of like where I came from or who I was. And also being like growing up in the States, so like New Jersey, being an Indian kid around a bunch of white people, it's like, who am I really, So it's kind of hard to like group myself with with the people around me. So being able to hear like where I came from or like where we came from, it's a piece of the puzzle that helps like I don't know, like solve that, I guess.
I love that so much. I love that so much. I remember when you and Vrinda went to India with us the first time in 23, you said you felt like it was home. And Vrinda said the same, that you both felt like India was home. And so hopefully this is helping, like you're saying, to put the puzzle pieces together to understand exactly why. So thank you so much for sharing that. That's exactly what we're trying to achieve here today. Thanks. Ro? Or Neil?
It's important to me because it teaches me about my ancestors and their journey, and I'm interested about it.
Yeah. When you understand how strong and resilient your ancestors are, then it shows how strong you are because their strength runs through your veins. And so you are just as mighty and powerful as they are. Thank you, Neil. Vrinda?
Hi, everyone. So I don't know how many other people get asked this question, but whenever I am speaking to another Indian person, without fail, the question is asked, what part of India are you from?
Mhm.
And then I tell them, well, I'm not from India. My family's from Trinidad. And they almost never know where Trinidad is. I have to explain it to them. And it kind of becomes like I'm less Indian than them. But so they even ask like, so you're not Indian? I tell them I am Indian. I'm just not from India. So I feel like just us existing is a really good opportunity to spread awareness for our ancestors and the things that we went through. And I'm very grateful to have attended this session today to be able to better represent our ancestors and what they went through.
I love that. Thank you, Brenda. Thank you so much. And I'm sure every single body here has been asked that question. Even when we go to India, they say, what part of India are you from? When they hear the accent, they're totally confused. Many of them don't know where Trinidad is or even that indentureship happened as well. So yes, that's a common problem. I felt like I saw another hand. No? All right. So as we wrap up, and I know that we've gone over, a bit more than we planned, but I think this was a really, really good and necessary conversation for us to have today. Indy mentioned us going to this place we didn't even know existed, this place where we thought 1.4 million Indians left India and nobody cared. This place where, to Vrinda's point, we feel less because we're not recognized as Indian. We were going through Calcutta and the guide said, you all want to go to the port? And we said, sure. We went to the port and that was emotional. And then we found out there was this inside of there. And so it says, from here they set forth, it's a dedication that was opened on January 11, 2011, and you all can read it with me. This memorial commemorates the thousands of indentured Indian laborers who sailed from Calcutta port between 1834 and 1920 to lands far away, seeking better livelihoods for themselves and their families. This is a celebration of their pioneering spirit, endurance, determination, and resilience. They made significant contributions to their adopted countries, yet cherished and passed on the spirit of Indianness, culture, values, traditions to their descendants. We salute them. Jai Hind. And so with that, I ask you, what will you do with this history and how will you honor their journey? Before we join in closing prayer, it would be remiss of me if I don't share my indentureship story. And my indentureship, I have siblings on here as well. This is also theirs. I was born in Trinidad in 1981 to my mother, Rukmin Ramnarayan Bridgelal, who was born in 1943 in Trinidad. Her father, Ramnarayan-Maharaj, he was born in Trinidad in 1913. And his father, Pandit Sitahal-Maharaj, who came on one of the ships somewhere between 1906 and 1911. We don't know which one, but we're trying to find out. This guy, and I'm assuming this is my grandmother, but nobody knows. My great-grandmother, Pandit Sitahal-Maharaj, this is our link, or our blood link to India. And so with this, I salute my ancestors. I salute all of your ancestors. I salute all of you for taking the time to join in this beautiful journey. And with that, we will join in a closing prayer. So we just take a couple of seconds as we think about our ancestors and this tremendous journey that they've made, all of the sacrifices that they have made on our behalf. It is on their sacrifices, on their shoulders, that we stand today and we decide where we go from here. Pray for the well-being of all. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah, Sarve Santu Niramayah, Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu, मा कश्चित् दुःखभाग् भवेत्. Om Shanti, 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 Harihi Om. Syavara Ramachandra ki Jai. Thank you all so much for joining. Thank you for staying on a little bit longer. Hopefully you found something valuable from this conversation. Hopefully it helped to fill in some gaps for you, and hopefully it inspired you to go and share some of this with somebody else. So thank you all. Please send me your feedback. As Dr. Nalla said, there's a need for this information to be shared. Maybe we will do some additional sessions. So send me your feedback so we can make sure the future ones are better. Thank you, and Sitaram.
Jai Hind.
Jai Hind.